The tow truck was already backing into my driveway at 7:42 in the morning, while a man in a fake police uniform circled my father's 1967 Mustang. As he owned it, he had a clipboard, a shiny badge, and zero legal authority to touch my property. This was not about an HOA violation. This was a calculated shakedown by Victor Manning, HOA president, who thought he could bully a quiet new neighbor out of a classic car. He saw my casual clothes and assumed I was just another helpless resident. But he made one fatal miscalculation. He did not know that the man he was harassing was a special agent for the FBI. 18 years in the public corruption unit. I was not just watching them break the law. I was building a federal case. Here is how I let them walk right into felony charges, dismantled their entire criminal operation with one flash of my badge, and why that cherry red Mustang is the last car they will ever try to tow. My father's Mustang was not just a car. It was a time machine made of steel and memories, a 1967 fastback, cherry red with a small dent in the rear fender from a parking lot incident back in '89. The bucket seats were original leather that smelled like motor oil, summer road trips, and the cologne my father wore every Sunday to church. He had bought it new the year I was born, drove it for 32 years, and left it to me when he passed with one instruction written on a napkin tucked in the glove box. Take care of her, son. She will take care of you. I had spent 18 months restoring the engine, replacing the carburetor, and rebuilding the transmission. Now the car sat in my garage in Pinewood Ridge Estates, Arizona, waiting for its first real drive. I was on leave from the bureau, 2 weeks of silence after 3 years of corruption wusses, and all I wanted was to finish the interior and feel the V8 rumble on an open highway. That morning started quietly. Coffee in hand, sunlight through the kitchen window, the neighborhood still asleep. Then I saw the shadow. A black SUV with a light bar on the roof crawled past my house, slowed, and stopped directly in front of my driveway. Not a police vehicle. I had spent 18 years learning the difference. No department markings, no official insignia, just a magnetic door sign reading Community Security Patrol and a driver who stepped out wearing tactical black like he was about to breach a building. He walked straight toward my open garage without hesitation, pulled out his phone, and began photographing my father's car. I set down my coffee. I did not move immediately. I watched. Badge number 7 was pinned crooked on his chest. Arizona plate, Alpha Bravo Charlie 1234, timestamp 7:42 a.m. The details logged themselves automatically, the same way they had logged themselves across 1,000 interviews, 1,000 crime scenes, 1,000 moments when observation meant the difference between conviction and acquittal. I walked outside with my hands loose at my sides, my expression flat, my pace unhurried. The man turned when he heard my footsteps, his right hand dropping to his belt in a motion that suggested a weapon he did not carry, the posture of borrowed authority. I stopped 10 feet away and asked if I could help him. He identified himself as Tony Briggs, Community Security Patrol, and informed me that my vehicle violated HOA regulations. Section 4.2, unregistered vehicles are visible from the street, aesthetic standards of the community. I told him the car was registered, insured, and parked inside my own garage on my own property. He said the vehicle was old and unsightly, that it did not meet Pinewood Ridge standards, and that I would receive an official violation notice by the end of day. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had delivered this speech many times to people who did not know how to fight back. I asked who authorized him to photograph private property. He smiled and said he had full authority from the HOA board. Then he climbed back into his fake patrol car and drove away with the light bar flashing once at the corner. I stood in my driveway and let the Arizona heat press against my face. My jaw did not tighten. My pulse did not rise. Years of sitting across from killers and embezzlers had taught me that anger was a luxury investigators could not afford. I went inside and opened my laptop. The CC&Rs for Pinewood Ridge Estates were available on the HOA website. 53 pages of covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Section 4.2 addressed vehicle regulations. I read every word. The section prohibited vehicles without wheels, abandoned vehicles, and vehicles parked on lawns. There was no mention of aesthetic standards, no prohibition against classic cars, no restriction on vehicles inside private garages. My father's Mustang violated nothing. I created a new folder on my desktop and labeled it Pinewood Ridge. First entry, Tony Briggs, badge 7, 7:42 a.m., false claim of violation of authority, photographed private property without consent, implied weapon on the belt, possible impersonation of law enforcement. I looked out the window at the Mustang sitting in the garage. My father had restored a 1955 Chevy with his own father before I was born, and he always said that cars outlived the men who built them only if someone cared enough to keep them running. This one would outlive me, too. If I did my job, these people had built something in Pinewood Ridge, a quiet machine of fake authority and manufactured fear. But machines had patterns, and patterns had weaknesses. They had operated unchallenged for years because no one had taken the time to document their methods, trace their money, or test whether their power was real. I had 2 weeks of leave and nothing but time. I would not confront them. I would not threaten them. I would simply watch, record, and wait until they handed me enough rope to hang themselves. The folder on my desktop would grow, the evidence would accumulate, and when the moment came, they would discover that the quiet neighbor with the old car had been building a case against them from the very first morning they made the mistake of stepping onto his property. The envelope arrived at 4:17 that afternoon, slipped through the mail slot with the kind of precision that suggested hand delivery rather than postal service. I heard the soft thud from my office, where I was reviewing case notes from my last investigation, a habit I could not break even on leave. The envelope was crisp white, with a return address printed in bold black letters. Pinewood Ridge Estates, Homeowners Association, official correspondence. I opened it standing in the hallway, the Arizona sun casting long shadows through the front windows. Inside was a single page with a header that tried very hard to look legal. Official violation notice, property address, owner name, violation code. The document accused me of violating Section 4.2 of the Community Covenants by maintaining a vehicle that did not meet aesthetic standards. The fine was $500 if not remedied within 7 days. The consequence for non-compliance was vehicle seizure by authorized towing partners. The signature at the bottom belonged to Victor Manning, President, Pinewood Ridge Estates, HOA. I photographed the notice front and back, then added it to the folder on my laptop. The language revealed more than it threatened. Words like seizure and authorized carried legal weight only when backed by an actual legal process. HOAs in Arizona could not seize private property without a court order. They could not impose fines for violations absent from their own governing documents. Everything about this notice was performance, a bluff dressed in official letterhead. I pulled up the CC&Rs again and confirmed what I already knew. Section 4.2 contained no aesthetic standards clause. The Mustang was registered, operational, and parked inside a private garage. The notice was not merely incorrect. It was a calculated fabrication designed to generate revenue from people who would pay rather than research. I needed to understand how deep this pattern ran, which meant I needed to talk to neighbors who had been here long enough to see it develop. I walked the neighborhood as the afternoon heat began to ease, moving at the pace of someone enjoying a new community rather than gathering intelligence. 3 houses down, a woman was watering plants in her front yard. She looked up as I approached and offered a cautious smile that did not quite reach her eyes. I introduced myself as the new neighbor on Oak Street. Her name was Maria Santos, and she had owned her house for 12 years. When I mentioned I had received a violation notice about my car, her watering can paused mid-arc. She glanced toward the street, then back at me. Her expression shifting through calculations I recognized from countless witness interviews. The look of someone deciding whether speaking was worth the risk. I waited without pressing. After a long moment, she asked what kind of car. I told her it was my father's '67 Mustang, that I was restoring it, that the notice claimed it violated aesthetic standards that did not exist in the CC&Rs. Something in her shoulders relaxed. She set down the watering can and said I should come up to the porch where we could talk properly. Maria spoke quietly, her voice barely above the hum of evening cicadas. She told me that 6 months ago. Her friend had parked overnight in Maria's driveway after a double shift at the hospital where they both worked. The car was gone by morning, towed at 3 a.m. by a company called Arizona Premier. The impound fee was $800. When her friend complained to the HOA, Victor Manning said the towing was authorized under community security protocols. No hearing, no appeal process, just a bill and a vague warning about causing further trouble. Maria had been awake that night, unable to sleep after her own shift. She heard the truck and filmed the whole thing from her bedroom window. Two men in black uniforms were hooking the car, while a third stood watch with a flashlight. She had kept the video, but never showed it to anyone official. She was afraid of what Victor might do if she challenged him openly. He controlled the board, the security patrol, and the flow of information through the community newsletter. People who pushed back found themselves buried in violations until they gave up or moved away. I asked how many families had been affected. Maria said at least a dozen that she knew of, probably more, who never spoke about it. The towing company was owned by someone from Victor's golf club. Every seized vehicle meant profit for Arizona Premier and, she suspected, a percentage flowing back to the HOA through channels that never appeared in any budget report. The Community Security Patrol had started 3 years ago as a neighborhood watch program, but Victor had transformed it into something else entirely. Men in uniforms that mimicked law enforcement, patrolling at all hours, photographing properties, measuring grass, and noting every deviation from Victor's personal vision of order. I thanked Maria and told her that her information was valuable. She asked what I planned to do. I said I was not sure yet, but I appreciated her trust. She nodded and picked up her watering can. The conversation closed as quietly as it had opened. I walked home as the sun dropped behind the mountains, the folder on my laptop expanding in my mind. One fabricated violation notice, one eyewitness to predatory towing, one video of a nighttime seizure by men impersonating officials. The connections formed a clear structure. Victor Manning at the center, Tony Briggs is enforcing his will, Arizona Premier is profiting from every car dragged away in darkness. I drafted a formal response to the violation notice that evening, requesting specific citation of the CC&R's provision allegedly violated and invoking Arizona Nonprofit Corporation law requiring documentation upon a member request. I sent it by certified mail with delivery confirmation. Then I ordered 4 security cameras with overnight shipping. If they intended to come for my father's car, every second would be recorded. The pattern was becoming visible. All I needed now was patience and evidence. They came on Saturday morning, 5 days after the violation notice, 2 days before the deadline expired. The early arrival was deliberate. I recognized the tactic from fraud cases I had prosecuted. Catch the target off guard before they have time to prepare a defense, before they realize the rules they were given never mattered. I was underneath the Mustang, checking the exhaust manifold, when I heard the diesel rumble of a heavy truck turning onto my street. I slid out from beneath the car and stood slowly, wiping grease from my hands with a shop rag. A flatbed tow truck from Arizona Premier had stopped at the end of my driveway, its engine idling, its driver climbing down from the cab with a clipboard in hand. Tony Briggs emerged from the black SUV that had followed behind, his fake badge catching the morning light. A third man in a cheap suit stepped out of the SUV's passenger side, carrying a leather folder and wearing the practiced smile of someone accustomed to explaining away uncomfortable situations. This one would be the talker, I realized. The reasonable voice meant to smooth over any resistance while Tony provided the muscle. Tony announced that my compliance period had ended and that my vehicle was being seized under HOA authority. I noted the lie without reacting. The deadline was Monday. They had moved early precisely because they expected compliance, not calendars. The man in the suit stepped forward and introduced himself as Gerald Whitmore, Community Liaison for Pinewood Ridge Estates. He explained in a tone of rehearsed sympathy that these situations were always unfortunate, that the HOA preferred cooperation over conflict, that if I simply allowed the vehicle to be removed today, we could discuss reduced penalties at the next board meeting. The offer was designed to sound reasonable while removing my leverage entirely. I had seen this script before, different actors performing the same play in boardrooms and back offices across a dozen corruption seats. Gerald handed me a document with a header reading "Seizure Order" and a red stamp that said Community Security Authority. The signature at the bottom belonged to Victor Manning. I read the document without speaking, letting the silence stretch until Gerald's smile began to falter. Then I looked up at Tony and asked one question. What court issued this order? Tony's jaw tightened. He said it was an HOA enforcement action authorized under community covenants. I turned to Gerald. What judge signed off on this seizure? Gerald's smile disappeared entirely. He said the HOA had internal authority to enforce compliance measures. I folded the document and placed it in my back pocket. Then I told them both, calmly and clearly, that I would be keeping this paper as evidence. I explained that the crime they were attempting to commit had a name, theft of a motor vehicle. I explained that the uniforms and badges designed to resemble law enforcement credentials had a name too, criminal impersonation. I did not recite statute numbers this time. I simply watched their faces as the words landed. The tow truck driver shifted uncomfortably near his vehicle. Gerald took a half step backward. Tony held his ground, but the certainty had drained from his posture. Tony recovered first. He said I was making a serious mistake, that Victor Manning had connections throughout the county, that people who caused problems in Pinewood Ridge tended to find their lives becoming very complicated. I asked if he was threatening me on camera. Tony's eyes flicked toward the garage, noticing for the first time the small black devices mounted at each corner. 4 cameras, recording continuously, backing up to a cloud server he could not reach. Gerald put a hand on Tony's arm and suggested they should leave and consult with the HOA's legal counsel. Tony shook off the hand but followed the advice. He pointed at me as he walked back to the SUV. This is not over. Reyes. I watched them drive away, the tow truck following empty, and allowed myself one small moment of satisfaction before returning to work. I reviewed the footage that evening, clipping the relevant sections into labeled files. Tony's admission that the deadline had not actually expired. Gerald's acknowledgement that no court was involved. The explicit threat about Victor's connections and complicated lives. I pulled out my phone and called Lieutenant Kevin Ortiz at the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. I had researched local law enforcement before purchasing my house, and Kevin's name had appeared in connection with prior complaints about Pinewood Ridge that had gone nowhere for lack of evidence. He answered on the 3rd ring. I identified myself and told him I wanted to file a formal complaint about individuals impersonating law enforcement officers and attempting vehicle theft in my neighborhood. Kevin listened without interrupting as I described the uniforms, the fake badge, the fraudulent seizure order, the recorded threat. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said this matched a pattern he had been tracking for 2 years but had never been able to prove. I told him I had video footage of the entire encounter with clear audio. His voice sharpened with interest. He asked if I would submit a formal statement and provide copies. I said I would bring everything to his office on Monday morning. Before hanging up, Kevin asked what I did for work. I told him I was in a related field and would explain when we met. He accepted the deflection without pressing. That night, I sat on my back porch watching the desert sky fade from orange to purple. The Mustang was safe, but the confrontation had revealed something important about Victor Manning's operation. They relied on speed and intimidation, on targets who would fold before asking questions. When someone pushed back, their playbook faltered. Gerald's retreat, Tony's empty threat, and the tow truck leaving without cargo. These were not the responses of professionals. These were the responses of amateurs who had never faced genuine opposition. Victor would try again. The challenge to his authority would demand escalation because anything less would expose the fragility beneath the performance. I was counting on exactly that. Every move he made now would feed the case I was building, and he had no idea the quiet neighbor with the old car had been taking notes from the very first morning. Monday morning, I walked into the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office with a folder containing 37 pages of documentation and a flash drive holding 4 video files. Lieutenant Kevin Ortiz met me in the lobby, a compact man in his 50s with gray at his temples and the watchful eyes of someone who had spent decades separating truth from performance. He led me to a conference room with a single window overlooking the parking lot and offered me coffee that I declined. I spread my materials across the table in chronological order. The violation notice was dated 6 days prior, the CC&Rs with relevant sections highlighted, photographs of Tony Briggs and his fake patrol vehicle, the fraudulent seizure order with Victor Manning's signature, transcripts of the recorded conversations. Kevin studied each document without speaking, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When he reached the video files, he plugged the flash drive into a laptop and watched the Saturday confrontation from beginning to end. Tony's threat about complicated lives, Gerald Whitmore's retreat when challenged, The tow truck is leaving empty. Kevin replayed the threat twice before closing the laptop. He told me that everything I had brought confirmed a pattern his office had suspected for years, but never proven. The Community Security Patrol had generated dozens of complaints since its formation, but no one had provided evidence this comprehensive. Previous attempts at prosecution had stalled when witnesses withdrew or accepted settlements with non-disclosure clauses. Victor Manning had insulated himself effectively, always maintaining distance between his orders and their execution. I asked Kevin what charges the evidence could support. He said Tony Briggs was exposed for criminal impersonation and attempted theft, both prosecutable under Arizona law. Victor Manning was more complicated. Proving his direct involvement would require testimony from someone inside the operation or financial records showing the kickback arrangement. I told Kevin I might be able to help with both, but I needed a few more days to develop additional sources. He leaned back and asked again what I did for a living. I reached into my jacket and removed my credentials, setting them on the table. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Special Agent Daniel Reyes, Public Corruption Unit. Kevin's expression shifted through surprise into something that looked like relief. He said that explained the documentation quality. I told him I was officially on leave and that this had started as a personal matter, but the scope suggested potential federal violations. Wire fraud if the kickback payments crossed state lines. Conspiracy if Victor had coordinated with Arizona Premier's ownership. Kevin nodded slowly and asked how I wanted to proceed. I said I needed 72 hours to gather testimony from other victims before making any federal referral. He agreed to hold off on local charges while I worked my sources. I left his office with a list of names Maria Santos had provided, families who had complained to neighbors but never to authorities. The next 3 days would require the kind of intensive interviewing I usually conducted with a team. I mapped out a schedule: 4 families on Monday evening, 4 Tuesdays, the remaining contacts on Wednesday morning, coffee and protein bars between stops, sleep when the work is done. The Henderson interview on Monday night changed my understanding of the case entirely. They had lost a pickup truck 18 months ago, towed from their own driveway. Standard story until Mr. Henderson mentioned that his wife had been recovering from surgery at the time, unable to drive for 6 weeks. The truck was her only way to get to physical therapy appointments. When she called Victor Manning to explain, he offered to reduce the impound fee from $900 to $600 if she agreed to sign a document acknowledging the violation. She signed because she needed her vehicle. Henderson pulled out the document and handed it to me. It was not an acknowledgement, it was a liability waiver releasing the HOA from any future claims related to vehicle enforcement. Victor had been collecting legal protection from his victims while pretending to offer mercy. I photographed the waiver and added it to my file. This was not just extortion. This was evidence of premeditation and consciousness of guilt. The Chen family's interview on Tuesday afternoon revealed the financial architecture. Mr. Chen operated a small catering business and kept meticulous records. When his delivery van was seized for displaying commercial signage, he had tracked every dollar of the recovery process. Impound fee paid to Arizona Premier, administrative fee paid to the HOA, late penalty added after 3 days, storage fee calculated daily. He showed me receipts totaling $1,400 for a vehicle that had been parked legally in his own driveway. But the detail that mattered most was the administrative fee receipt. It listed a post office box in Nevada as the remittance address. I asked Chen if he was certain about the address. He showed me the original envelope. Nevada meant interstate commerce. Nevada meant federal jurisdiction. Nevada meant wire fraud charges that carried sentences of up to 20 years. I completed 12 interviews by Wednesday noon, documenting losses totaling over $23,000 across the neighborhood. 8 families had interacted directly with Tony Briggs. 6 had vehicles towed by Arizona Premier. The Henderson waiver and the Chen receipt transformed a local harassment case into a federal prosecution target. I called Special Agent Diana Torres at the FBI Phoenix field office on Wednesday evening. Diana had worked with me on 3 public corruption cases over the past decade, and she understood how to build prosecutions that would survive judicial scrutiny. I described the situation without revealing my personal involvement, framing it as a tip I had received while on leave. She listened carefully, asked targeted questions about the Nevada connection and interstate banking, and concluded that the case had a solid federal nexus. She offered to run preliminary background checks on Victor Manning and Arizona Premier. I accepted and told her I would have a comprehensive briefing package ready by Monday. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen reviewing the evidence spread across my table. The case had grown beyond a dispute over my father's car. Victor Manning had built a machine that extracted money from his neighbors through manufactured fear, and he had done it carelessly enough to leave a trail any competent investigator could follow. The question now was not whether he would face consequences, but how completely those consequences would dismantle everything he had constructed. I looked at the Mustang gleaming in the garage. My father used to say that patience was just preparation in slow motion. The preparation was complete. The federal machinery was beginning to turn. And Victor Manning had no idea that every document he had ever signed was about to become evidence in his own prosecution. Victor Manning's response came at 2:17 Thursday morning. I was awake, reviewing the briefing package I had prepared for Diana Torres, when the motion alerts from my security system triggered simultaneously on all 4 cameras. I switched to the live feed and watched 2 figures in dark clothing approach my driveway from the street. The taller one moved with a slight hitch in his left step that I recognized immediately. Tony Briggs. His partner was younger, faster, scanning the neighborhood with the nervous energy of someone who had not done this often enough to be comfortable. They split at the edge of my property, Tony heading toward the garage while the younger man took position at the curb with a flashlight pointed at the ground. The night was silent except for the distant hum of the highway and the soft scrape of Tony's boots on concrete. I did not call the police. I wanted every second captured. I wanted them to commit fully before I ended this. Tony knelt at the garage door and produced a slim tool from his jacket pocket. The security light triggered when he shifted his weight, flooding the driveway with harsh white light. He flinched but did not retreat. His shadow stretched long and angular across the concrete as he abandoned the lock and moved to the side window, cupping his hands against the glass to peer at the Mustang inside. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the quick movements of a man operating on instructions he did not fully trust. His partner at the curb checked both directions twice in 30 seconds, his flashlight beam twitching with each glance. Tony photographed the car through the window, the flash briefly illuminating the interior of the garage. Then he walked to my front door and taped a document flat against the wood, pressing it with both palms before stepping back. They returned to a dark sedan parked 3 houses down and drove away without headlights until they reached the corner. I waited 5 minutes before opening my door. The document carried the familiar HOA letterhead, but the tone had shifted entirely. Final notice of non-compliance. The accusations had expanded beyond the vehicle: harassment against HOA officials, interference with community security operations, creating a hostile environment for residents. The fine structure had abandoned any pretense of legitimacy. $1,000 per day, retroactive to the original violation date. Total demanded, $6,000. Deadline for payment, noon, Friday. The final paragraph threatened immediate vehicle seizure, property liens, and collection agency referral. The signature was Victor Manning's, but the text contained 3 spelling errors and inconsistent formatting. Someone had typed this in haste, probably within hours of learning that their previous tactics had failed. I photographed both sides and reviewed the security footage, confirming clear timestamps and identifiable faces. Then I called Lieutenant Kevin Ortiz on his personal cell. He answered on the second ring, voice rough with interrupted sleep, and told me to send everything immediately. He would review it first thing in the morning. I sat at my kitchen table as the sky began to lighten outside. The pattern had shifted in ways that interested me professionally. The escalation from manufactured violations to physical intrusion had compressed into less than 2 weeks. The demand amount had jumped from $500 to $6,000 without any proportional change in alleged offenses. The document's errors suggested it had bypassed whatever review process Victor typically used. These were not the moves of someone executing a plan. These were the moves of someone reacting to pressure from a direction he could not identify. I made a note to check whether any of the families I had interviewed might have mentioned my questions to the wrong person. The phone rang at 6:45, unlisted number. I answered and activated the recording function I had installed after the first violation notice. Victor Manning's voice came through with a quality I had not heard before. Not anger, something closer to persuasion, the tone of a man who believed he could still negotiate his way out of trouble. He said he wanted to resolve our misunderstanding before things went further. He said he had been overzealous and was willing to withdraw all fines if I agreed to remove my vehicle from the community within 30 days. Generous offer, would not be repeated. I asked if he was aware that his security officer had trespassed on my property at 2 in the morning. The persuasion evaporated. Several seconds of silence. Then Victor said he had no knowledge of any such activity and that Tony Briggs sometimes acted on his own initiative. I told him I had video footage of the intrusion, including Tony delivering a document with Victor's signature. The silence stretched longer. When Victor spoke again, his voice had changed completely. Gone was the neighborly concern, the pretense of reasonable accommodation. What remained was something colder, more calculated. He said I clearly did not understand how things worked in Pinewood Ridge. He said he had spent 15 years building relationships with people who mattered in this county: commissioners, judges, business owners. He said that people who caused problems for the community tended to find that their own problems multiplied in unexpected ways. Tax audits, permit denials, professional complications. He said he was offering me one final chance to be smart about this. Then he hung up. I saved the recording and added it to my evidence folder. Victor had just moved beyond simple extortion into something more sophisticated. He was threatening to weaponize government processes against a private citizen. In federal terms, that was conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of law, a charge that carried up to 10 years. I looked at the evidence accumulating on my screen and allowed myself a small smile. Victor thought he was warning me. He had no idea he was confessing. Friday morning arrived with the kind of Arizona clarity that made everything feel sharper than it should. Blue sky without clouds. Dry heat is already building at 7:30. The Mustang sat in the garage where it had sat for 3 months, patient and gleaming, waiting for a drive that kept getting postponed. I was finishing my second cup of coffee when I heard the familiar diesel rumble of a heavy truck turning onto Oak Street. I set down the cup and walked to the front window. The Arizona Premier flatbed was back, this time accompanied by 2 vehicles instead of 1. Tony Briggs in his black SUV with the fake light bar, and behind him, a silver Mercedes that I recognized from the HOA website's board member photos. Victor Manning had come personally. This was different from the previous attempts. Before, Victor had operated through proxies, maintaining distance between his orders and their execution. His presence here meant he believed this confrontation would be the last. He was right about that, just not in the way he imagined. The formation that approached me was designed for a different kind of encounter than our previous meetings. Tony Briggs walked with a slower cadence, his hand not resting on his belt, but swinging loosely at his side. Relaxed, certain, Victor Manning moved beside him rather than behind, claiming equal presence in what he clearly expected to be a victory march. Gerald Whitmore had left his leather folder in the car, carrying nothing but a thin smile that suggested the negotiation phase was over. Even the tow truck driver had positioned his flatbed at an angle that blocked any vehicle exit from my garage. They had come not to threaten, but to execute. I noticed Maria Santos watching from her porch 3 houses down. 2 other neighbors had emerged to observe. The audience Victor had wanted was assembling. He did not yet understand that audiences could witness more than one kind of outcome. Tony stopped 6 feet from where I stood and announced that my final deadline had passed. He produced a document and held it toward me without the theatrical flourish of previous encounters. Just a man completing paperwork. Seizure authorization, effective immediately. I was to step aside and allow Arizona Premier to remove the vehicle. I took the document and examined it, using the moment to read the configuration of bodies around me. Tony had positioned himself to my left, ready to step forward the moment I showed resistance. Victor stood directly ahead, arms crossed, chin slightly elevated. Gerald had drifted toward the garage, perhaps planning to direct the tow truck driver once the formalities concluded. They had rehearsed this. They had done it before to others. The machinery was smooth and practiced. I looked up from the document and asked Victor directly whether he had personally authorized this seizure. His chin lifted another degree. He said he had, that the board had granted emergency powers, that this was the consequence of my choices. I nodded slowly and reached into my back pocket. The wallet I removed was unremarkable, brown leather, worn at the edges, but what it contained changed everything. I flipped it open and held it at chest height, angled so that Tony, Victor, and Gerald could all see clearly. The gold badge caught the morning sunlight and threw a bright reflection across Tony's face. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent Daniel Reyes. I let the silence hold for 3 full seconds, watching the information arrive differently in each of them. Tony Briggs processed the badge the way a soldier processes an unexpected explosion. His body locked before his mind caught up, every muscle freezing in place while his eyes worked to confirm what they were seeing. The document in his hand did not droop or fall. His fingers simply stopped existing as relevant appendages. He became a statue of a man who had been reaching for something that had suddenly transformed into a trap. Victor Manning's response was more complex. His crossed arms did not unfold. His chin did not lower. Instead, something behind his eyes began moving very quickly, calculating, recalculating, searching for an angle that would restore his position. His face remained composed for almost 2 full seconds before the calculations failed. Then the composure did not collapse so much as empty, like water draining from a vessel, leaving the structure intact but hollow. Gerald Whitmore simply left, not dramatically, not with any announcement. He turned and walked toward the Mercedes with the measured pace of a man who had suddenly remembered an appointment elsewhere. He did not look back. The car door opened and closed. The engine started. Gerald Whitmore drove away from Pinewood Ridge and, as I would later learn, never returned. The tow truck driver had been watching from beside his flatbed. When Gerald's Mercedes pulled away, he made his own decision. The wheel dolly he had been preparing went back into the truck bed. The engine revved. Arizona Premier retreated down Oak Street without a word exchanged, leaving Victor and Tony stranded in my driveway with a federal agent and a growing audience of neighbors. I lowered the badge, but kept it visible. My voice remained level, almost conversational. Mr. Briggs, criminal impersonation, attempted theft, trespass, and the breaking charge from Thursday morning. I have video documentation with timestamps for each offense. Tony's statue finally cracked. His hand came up to his fake badge, touching it as if he had forgotten it was there, then dropped back to his side. He took 1 step backward. Mr. Manning. I shifted my attention without raising my voice. Extortion, wire fraud, conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of law. I have recorded conversations, financial records tracing the Arizona Premier kickback arrangement, and testimony from 12 families documenting a pattern of fraudulent enforcement. I also have your voice on tape, threatening to weaponize government processes against me and then denying knowledge of activities you personally authorized. That denial, made to a federal agent, adds a separate charge under Title 18. Victor's hollow composure attempted to refill itself. He straightened his shoulders and said there had been a misunderstanding. He said he was simply maintaining community standards. He said federal agents had no jurisdiction over HOA matters and that this was a civil dispute between neighbors. The words came out with decreasing conviction, each sentence weaker than the last. I let him finish. Then I explained that jurisdiction attached the moment his operation used interstate wire transfers and telephone communications to conduct fraud. I explained that the Nevada address on the Arizona Premier payment receipts established federal nexus beyond any reasonable challenge. I explained that the evidence I had compiled would be presented to the United States Attorney's Office on Monday morning. Victor opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. He had run out of angles. The sound of approaching vehicles ended whatever might have come next. 2 Maricopa County Sheriff's cruisers turned onto Oak Street, light bars flashing but sirens silent. Lieutenant Kevin Ortiz stepped out of the lead car and walked toward us with the unhurried pace of a man who had been waiting 3 years for this moment. He nodded to me, then turned to Victor and Tony. He said he had some questions and suggested they might want to contact their attorneys. Victor looked at me one final time. The hollow expression had been replaced by something else now. Not anger, not fear, recognition. The recognition of a man who had finally understood that the rules he thought he was playing by had never been the actual rules at all. He followed Kevin toward the cruiser without speaking. Tony went with the second deputy, his hand rising once more to touch the fake badge on his chest before dropping away for the last time. Maria Santos had crossed the street while the deputies were securing their passengers. She stopped beside me and watched the cruisers pull away. She asked if it was really over. I told her it was just beginning, but the beginning was the hardest part, and that part was done. She nodded slowly, then looked at the Mustang gleaming in the garage behind us. She said she thought my father's car had brought good luck to the neighborhood. I told her the car had nothing to do with luck. It had everything to do with preparation, and Victor Manning had given me plenty of time to prepare. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Sunday evening at the community clubhouse, called by a group of residents who had gathered enough signatures to invoke the emergency session clause in the bylaws. I had provided copies of my evidence to Lieutenant Ortiz, who had shared relevant portions with the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office. The criminal investigation was proceeding through official channels, but the community needed its own reckoning. Victor Manning and Tony Briggs had been released on bond after their Friday detention, pending formal charges. Both had been advised by their attorneys to avoid contact with witnesses and to refrain from HOA activities. Victor apparently believed that the advice did not apply to meetings held on his territory. He arrived at the clubhouse 15 minutes early, wearing a suit instead of his usual golf attire, flanked by a woman I did not recognize who carried a legal briefcase, his lawyer, preparing for damage control. The room filled quickly. More than 120 residents crowded into a space designed for 80, folding chairs brought from storage, people standing along the walls and in the doorway. I sat in the third row beside Maria Santos, who had spent the weekend contacting every family she knew had been affected by Victor's operation. The Henderson family was there, the Chen family near the front, the elderly Martinez couple seated near the emergency exit. Lieutenant Ortiz stood at the back in civilian clothes, observing but not participating. A woman named Patricia Wellman called the meeting to order. She was a retired schoolteacher who had lived in Pinewood Ridge for 23 years and had served on the original HOA board before Victor's tenure. She explained that the meeting had been called to address concerns about HOA governance and invited any resident with relevant information to speak. Victor's lawyer immediately objected, claiming discussion of ongoing legal matters was inappropriate. Patricia responded that residents had a right to discuss management of their own community. Victor's lawyer sat down, but kept her hand on her briefcase. Mr. Henderson spoke first. He walked to the front, holding the liability waiver I had photographed during our interview. He explained how his wife's car had been towed while she was recovering from surgery, how Victor had offered to reduce the impound fee in exchange for signing what he was told was an acknowledgement form. The document had actually released the HOA from all future liability. His voice cracked when he described feeling trapped. His wife reached up and took his hand. A woman 2 rows behind me whispered to her husband that she had signed something similar. 3 other heads nodded in recognition. Mr. Chen took a different approach entirely. He walked to the front carrying a manila folder and spoke with the flat precision of an accountant presenting quarterly results. He itemized every dollar his family had lost when their catering van was seized: impound fee, administrative fee, daily storage, late penalty, $1,400 total for a vehicle parked legally in his own driveway. He held up the receipt showing the Nevada post office box where administrative fees were remitted. He asked, rhetorically, why an Arizona HOA would send money to Nevada. Then he sat down without waiting for an answer. The question hung in the air. Victor's lawyer began writing rapidly on a legal pad. The veteran with the disability ramp did not speak at all. His daughter spoke for him. She was perhaps 30 years old, composed and precise, and she read from a prepared statement. Her father had served 22 years in the Army. He had been wounded in Iraq. The accessibility ramp the HOA cited as an unauthorized structure was required for him to enter and exit his own home. The fine was $200 per week until the structure was removed. Her father had paid over $3,000 rather than tear down something he needed to survive. She folded her statement and asked Victor directly whether he considered that outcome consistent with community standards. Victor did not answer. Someone in the back called him a disgrace. The veteran's daughter returned to her seat without acknowledging the outburst. Victor had been taking notes throughout the testimony, his posture suggesting engagement rather than defensiveness. When Patricia Wellman asked if anyone wished to respond, he stood with the air of a man prepared to address reasonable concerns. He thanked the speakers for their candor. He acknowledged that mistakes had been made in the pursuit of maintaining property values. He announced that the board would form a review committee to examine enforcement procedures and consider refunds for any fines that had been improperly assessed. His tone was measured and professional. His lawyer nodded approvingly. For 30 seconds, he almost succeeded in repositioning himself as a leader addressing legitimate grievances. Then Mrs. Martinez raised her hand. Patricia recognized her. The 74-year-old woman did not stand or walk to the front. She simply asked, from her seat near the emergency exit, whether the review committee would also examine the $47,000 in payments to Arizona Premier Towing over the past 3 years. Victor's measured composure flickered. His lawyer's pen stopped moving. Mr. Chen added, without being recognized, that he had calculated the figure from publicly available budget documents. Someone else asked how much of that money had flowed back to HOA officers. The questions came faster now, overlapping, building. Victor raised his hands for quiet. He said these were complex financial matters that required proper investigation. He said speculation was irresponsible. He said the real problem was outside agitators who had come into the community and manipulated vulnerable residents into making accusations they did not understand. He pointed at me. He called me a troublemaker who had turned neighbors against each other. He said I would regret interfering with Pinewood Ridge. I did not stand. I held up my phone and informed him that I was recording his statement and that threatening a federal witness in front of 120 additional witnesses was unlikely to improve his legal position. Victor's lawyer yanked his arm hard enough to pull him off balance. She whispered something sharp into his ear. He sat down heavily. The professional facade finally shattered beyond repair. Patricia Wellman moved quickly to capitalize on the moment. She called for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA board, citing Article 7, Section 3 of the community bylaws. She asked for a show of hands in favor. Arms rose throughout the room, a forest of raised hands that took the volunteer counters nearly a minute to tally. 114 in favor, 3 opposed. Patricia announced that the board was dissolved, effective immediately under the emergency governance provisions. She proposed an interim committee of 5 residents to manage community affairs until proper elections could be held within 60 days. The committee was approved by voice vote. Maria Santos was named interim president. Victor Manning stood and walked toward the exit without waiting for the meeting to adjourn. His lawyer followed 3 steps behind, briefcase clutched to her chest. Neither of them looked back. The room erupted into conversations the moment the door closed. Neighbors turning to neighbors, some crying, some laughing, all of them lighter than they had been 2 hours before. The criminal proceedings concluded 4 months after the community meeting. Victor Manning accepted a plea agreement that spared him the uncertainty of a federal trial. 2 years in federal prison for wire fraud and conspiracy to deprive citizens of civil rights. 5 years of supervised probation following release. Full restitution of $47,000. A permanent ban from serving on any homeowners association board in Arizona. The judge noted during sentencing that Victor had exploited a position of trust to systematically victimize the people he was supposed to serve. Victor stood motionless as the sentence was read, his expensive suit hanging looser than it had 4 months earlier. When the bailiff approached to escort him from the courtroom, Victor glanced back at the gallery one final time. Whatever he was looking for, he did not find it. The door closed behind him without ceremony. Tony Briggs took a different path. He attempted to withdraw his guilty plea 3 days before sentencing, claiming he had been coerced by Victor into participating in the scheme. The judge denied the motion after reviewing the evidence, including video footage of Tony threatening residents while wearing his fake badge with obvious enthusiasm. 18 months in state prison, his uniform and credentials were photographed for the case file, then destroyed. Gerald Whitmore avoided prison entirely by providing testimony that mapped the internal workings of Victor's operation, including the cash payments from Arizona Premier for each vehicle seized. He moved to New Mexico before the trial ended and never returned to collect his belongings from Pinewood Ridge. Arizona Premier lost its business license permanently. The owner paid $50,000 in fines and was barred from the towing industry in Maricopa County for a decade. The restitution process brought its own form of closure. A court-appointed administrator processed claims from 31 families, totaling more than $63,000. The Martinez family received their $3,000 on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Mrs. Martinez called Maria Santos that evening, crying so hard she could barely speak. She said it was not about the money, it was about being believed. The veteran whose accessibility ramp had been cited as an unauthorized structure received his refund along with a hand-delivered letter from the new board, formally apologizing for the violation and permanently exempting all disability accommodations from architectural review. His daughter framed the letter and hung it in his living room next to his service medals. Maria Santos won the first genuinely contested HOA election in a decade with 73% of the vote. The new board adopted comprehensive reforms, eliminated the community security patrol, and sold the black SUV with its illegal light bar at auction. The proceeds went to a community scholarship fund. I finished restoring the Mustang on a Saturday morning in October, 5 months after Victor Manning first sent Tony Briggs to photograph my father's car. The interior was complete now. The leather seats reconditioned, the dashboard polished, the radio replaced with a period-appropriate unit that pulled in AM stations, the way it had when my father drove Route 66 in 1972. I sat behind the wheel and let the engine idle, listening to the V8 rumble that had been the soundtrack of my childhood summers. My father had left me this car with one instruction: take care of her, and she will take care of you. I had kept my promise. I pulled out of the garage and drove through Pinewood Ridge for the first time since moving in. Maria Santos waved from her porch. The Henderson family was working in their front yard, their truck parked openly in the driveway. I slowed as I passed the Martinez house and saw the old woman sitting on her front steps, watching the street with an expression I had not seen on her face before. She was smiling, not at me specifically, just at the afternoon, at the neighborhood, at whatever small piece she had finally recovered. I raised 2 fingers from the steering wheel in a wave. She raised her hand in return. I turned onto the main road and accelerated. The Arizona desert stretching golden on both sides, the mountains purple in the distance. The wind came through the open windows, carrying the smell of sage and dry earth. I thought about calling Diana Torres to check on my next assignment, then decided it could wait until Monday. The Mustang climbed toward the highway, engine singing, and I let it run.